Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's show, where I'm here with my guest, Aurelien Mondon. Do you want to say a little bit about your background for people to introduce yourself?
Yeah, of course. So I'm a senior lecturer or associate professor in politics at the University of Bath. I've done a lot of work. A lot of my work has been originally on the far right, but increasingly, what I've done is moving towards looking at the way mainstream elites end up enabling far-right politics and mainstreaming far-right politics. So a lot of my work recently has been actually on the role of mainstream media, mainstream politicians, mainstream academics as well to an extent, and the way they, instead of countering the far-right as they claim, they end up actually helping it along and at times actively enabling it.
So that's broadly the topic of what we're going to be talking about today. Just because no expectation that you know anything about my channel, but I do a bunch of stuff to do broadly with like philosophy and religion. So my main interaction with this stuff, and I guess my audience's interest, is because a lot of the religion discourse has become very heavily politicized, linked up with like, kind of Christian nationalism and people with all sorts of ideas. And so this sort of thing is kind of interest to me. And I think people in my audience from that angle as well. So I was wondering, to start off, if you could talk about how you think about political taxonomy. So what do you mean when you're talking about like, the right and the left, and particularly when you're applying terms like far right or even far left, and what do you mean by those things?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, this is a great question. I think it's a good place to start, and this is something that has become increasingly muddled. For example, we've seen recently some people trying to argue that actually fascism is an ideology of the left, or it's neither left nor right, and I think that's a common mistake. But I think that's also a strategy from the far right to kind of push these kind of ideas. We saw Elon Musk actually playing into the hands of the AfD in Germany, a far right party, when the AfD claimed that actually the Nazis were really socialists rather than far right. And so therefore the AfD had nothing to do with the Nazis. And of course that's a common mistake, because Nazism is national socialism, and so people kind of fall for it and believe that actually Hitler was a socialist, or that Mussolini, because he was, when he was younger, on the left, meant that his fascism was also a left-wing ideology. But it's been very clearly shown by historians, by political theorists, by political scientists, that actually fascism is very much a right-wing ideology. So what do we mean by right-wing ideology? Well, it's an ideology that is based on a belief that inequalities are natural and that they are generally a good thing. The fact that Nazism, fascism, or Trumpism to an extent, or parties like the AfD in Germany, the Rassemblement National in France, and by yourself at the moment are called far right, is because this is actually very much core to their politics. So that means that they tend to tap into kind of racism, although quite often they try to hide it and pretend they are not racist. But of course, if we look at their discourse, it's a question of exclusion, a question of like defending white supremacy quite openly. They tend to tap also into misogyny, into ableism, and into various kind of other exclusionary forms of politics. The idea that some people are better than others. So inherently, this kind of politics are also elitist. They believe in the idea that some people are better at leading than others, and some people deserve a bigger part of a cake than others as well. So by contradistinction, and of course it's not perfect as a spectrum, right? Because of course the borders between the far right, the mainstream, the left and the far left can be fuzzy, right? And people can jump from one to another. Although I don't believe in the horseshoe theory. I think it's a very problematic kind of conception. If you move far enough to the left, you're not going to fall onto the far right, and vice versa. So these politics have really nothing in common, because far left politics would be about equality, would be about the economy as well. Which is quite important. The economy on the far left would be about kind of sharing the means of production, sharing resources, while the far right is very much about, again, inequalities in terms of economics. So, a belief in some people having more than others, a belief in capitalism generally, although a different form maybe to the one we have, but not necessarily a different form to the one we're heading towards, which is, big corporations controlling everything and everyone at the same time for the benefit of the few.
So one of very few talking points that I might have a bit of sympathy for, that sometimes, like podcasters who might fall under this like far right category say, is something like the idea that the old ways of understanding or labeling, like political categories, they don't really work anymore, or something like that. And I think I can see this a little bit, because along the axes where people seem to be polarized, it just seems to be a whole mishmash of like random identities mushed together in various ways. And I was wondering, do you have any thoughts on this idea that maybe like the classical political compass dimension of right left isn't necessarily adequate for explaining our current political landscape, or do you think that we should still think about it that way? This is an attempt to maybe reclassify oneself in a way that might seem more neutral or something like that?
Yeah, look, I love this question as well, because I think it's something that is so important in many ways in the mainstreaming of far right politics. This idea that politics doesn't matter anymore, that it's not a question of label, that's just like pointless labels. But I think it touches on a number of things here. The first thing that it touches on is really how hollowed our democracies have become. The fact that when we think about politics, we think about political parties and elections, and therefore people tend to think that there's no more difference between the left and the right because, the Democrats and the Republicans are the same, or, the Labour Party and the Conservative in the UK are the same, and, they all want the same thing, and they all want to kind of like politics of austerity, they don't care about us, all of this kind of thing. So people tend to think that the left and the right are the same because they assume that the left and the right is the Republicans and the Democrats, or whatever parties are center-left and center-right in their country. And of course, center-left, center-right doesn't mean much, because what we've seen is actually a rightward movement of all parties. So the right-wing parties have moved far further to the right in recent years in many countries and contexts, but also the nominally left-wing parties have moved also to the right. If you look at what the Democrats have done on various issues, it's pretty clear. If you same with the Labour Party in the UK, with various parties in Europe and in other countries as well. So if you think about electoral politics, left and right is a bit meaningless. Yeah, absolutely, 100%. But the problem is democracy shouldn't be limited to electoral politics and should go much further than that. And if you go much further than that, and if you look actually at the economy or at kind of economic politics, or if you look at ideology, then there are still very strong differences between the left and the right. And they are the ones we need to return to, the ones that I was talking about before, in terms of equality, in terms of rights, in terms of economic rights, economic possibilities, economic justice. But also, if you think about kind of key issues such as the environment, for example, the left and the right are very different. If you think about workers' rights, the left and the right are very different. If you think about immigration, about human rights, the left and the right are very different. If you think about Palestine and the right of Palestinians to leave, the left and the right are also very different.
Great. So another term just to kind of like quickly define or clarify is liberalism, because we're going to talk about liberalism a bit more as we go on. So what does liberalism mean as you're using it?
Yeah, you've picked the best questions. It almost feels like we prepared that. So I'm very excited to talk about this as well. So liberalism is something that I've worked on a lot on recently, and crucially, what I do is in my work is not define it, because what I'm interested in is looking at liberalism as an empty signifier. So I could define it for you if you wanted, but it'd be quite hard actually. If you look at definitions of liberalism, it's not like, for example, communism or socialism, where you could go back to kind of a seminal text. You could go back to Marx, to Engels, to the Communist Manifesto, and so on, and to the people who have built on that. Liberalism is a much more flexible ideology, and from the very beginning, liberalism took many shapes and forms. And today, when you think about liberalism, you could think about a kind of more kind of cultural and social liberalism, the idea that people believe in minorities having rights and so on. But then, what does it mean in terms of economic terms? And again, liberalism here can mean a lot of different things. So what I'm interested in my research is not so much to look at what liberalism is as an ideal, but what liberalism does in really existing life, if you want. So what I talk about is really existing liberalism, because quite often when we talk about liberalism, we talk about this liberal fantasy, this idea that liberalism is progressive because it gives us rights, it gives us protections, the rule of law, separation of power, and things like that. But these things are not liberal at all. These things were also part of kind of many socialist ideals, democracies, anarchists, and so on. So it's not just down to liberalism. More importantly as well, if we look at the history of liberalism and really existing liberalism, many of the rights that today we associate with liberalism, such as workers' rights, various kind of laws that have been passed to protect minorities and so on, they were passed against the liberal elite of the time. The liberal elite was not happy about that because they felt that their interests or privilege was threatened at the time. So they were passed because pressure was applied by people who would not have called themselves liberals, who would have called themselves socialists or revolutionaries, or and all of these kind of things. So I think we have internalized the idea that liberalism is progress, and this is partly a result of course, liberalism triumphing over the Nazis with communism after the Second World War, but also liberalism apparently triumphing over communism in the late 20th century, in the early 1990s, which led us to the end of history. The idea that this kind of ridiculous idea, even by its own proponents, that history had ended, and all we would have in the future would be a beautiful kind of liberal utopia. And of course that didn't pan out, right? Because liberalism hasn't been able to respond to the many crises we are facing, and has been forced to face its own contradictions, and the fact that liberalism can certainly move towards progress, but it can also move towards reaction, depending on where pressure is coming from. So, in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s to some extent, when there was a lot of pressure put by progressive forces and by the left on the liberal elite, they could move towards more progressive forms of politics. But what we've seen in the 2000s and 2010s and 20s is that the momentum is on the reactionary side, and we can see liberalism bending over and backwards to actually appease reactionaries. We saw that after the election of the first election of Donald Trump and the second election of Donald Trump, that actually we cannot count on our liberal elite to fight fascism the way they should. They've backed down very quickly, but whether it's in the US or beyond. I think we saw it as well in 2020 when Biden was elected, and pretty much the first thing he said was talking about reconciliation. And it's like, reconciliation with who, right? With the people who have thrown the communities that you're supposed to defend under the bus. This is problematic.
So would it be right, just to check I've kind of understood what you're saying, to say what you're doing is kind of, drawing around a set of economies, places, and times, and kind of saying, well, somewhere in there, that's kind of liberalism, and I'm going to engage in just like a descriptive practice rather than sort of going from like pure theory about what liberalism is, something like that. Is that correct?
Yeah, a bit of that. I mean, in a way, my starting point is, when I work on liberalism, my starting point was to kind of unpick, in a way, the kind of belief that liberalism is a bulwark against fascism, which we've internalized since the Second World War, in a way, which is completely ahistorical, right? Liberalism was not a bulwark against fascism. In fact, liberalism was very content to have fascism alongside for quite a while in the 1930s, 20s, and so on. And it's it's only when particular interests are threatened that things change. And so what I wanted to do really was to unpick this kind of myth, this kind of fantasy that we've built around liberalism that prevents us from actually looking at the way far-right politics can be enabled and can be accommodated by liberalism in many ways, or by people who call themselves liberals or the liberal elite. So it's not about individuals at the end of the day, right? I mean, it's interesting because I was having an argument with various people on Blue Sky today about this, and I know that in the US, for example, the term liberal probably sounds a bit more left-wing or a bit more progressive than it does maybe in political theory or in Europe potentially. But at the same time, I think what I'm interested in is really the role that the signifier plays. The fact that you can call yourself a liberal and be quite left-wing, and honestly left-wing, and really want kind of progressive change on various fronts. But you can also call yourself liberal to try and pretend that you're not as bad as the fascists. And I think what we've seen in a way in many democracies is the liberal elite wanting to stay in power and demanding the left, demanding progressives, however they call themselves, to vote for them against their own will because they're not as bad as the fascists, and then ended up doing pretty much exactly what the fascists wanted, or paving the way for them to take power. That's what we saw in the US, that's what we're seeing in the UK at the moment, that's what we're seeing in a lot of other countries, right? And so I think in a way this politics of the least worst is really unhelpful, and that's why I think from my point of view we really need to question the role that liberalism as a signifier, as a term, plays in preventing us from thinking beyond it, from thinking beyond actually capitalism to an extent.
Yeah, something that is kind of ironic from my point of view, I guess, that I've come to notice over the past couple of years is that whenever someone self-identifies as a classical liberal, there's probably a high probability that they're associated with or on the payroll of Viktor Orban in some way, which is sort of somewhat, it's kind of ironic. The guy who calls himself illiberal. But
well, that's right. Yeah, I mean, it's ironic, and I think a lot of my work on liberalism actually started with the concept of illiberalism, which I found deeply unhelpful, because the concept of illiberalism is coined by Viktor Orban, like the far right leader in Hungary, and what's interesting about Orban is he called his new system illiberal democracy, and everyone lashed on the term illiberal as if that was the horrible thing. But what was the horrible thing in illiberal democracy was democracy, because Orban is not a democrat by any way, shape, or form. And Hungary, like what everything is done in Hungary, is try to destroy democracy. And so instead, we've wasted a lot of time discussing how Orban is not liberal. Well, we should have discussed how he's not a Democrat, right? What is it that we want? Do we want this kind of murky idea of liberalism that can please neoliberals, that can please people who believe that workers shouldn't have any rights or that workers should have rights? Or do we want to actually believe in democracy, where everyone can actually have a say and an equal say in the future of our planet, right? So I think, discussions around liberalism in a way tend to be very much diversions, and that's why I'm worried about the left kind of trying to reclaim that term, because it can be hijacked very, very easily by not necessarily the far right, although they do try to do it sometimes, but mostly by the forces of capital that have very few interests in common with progressives.
So there's a lot of sort of storytelling that takes place around some of these political ideas like liberalism and stuff. And I wondered, I think that this is a theme that I get in some of your work as well. So I wondered if you wanted to talk about this, which is the idea of this like arc of moral progress pertaining to democracy or liberalism. I mean, often on social media, you'll see accounts like Return or Trad West or whatever, hailing back to days in ancient Greece or Rome when things were purportedly better, and then they got worse, and now we've been on this arc of like progress up to 1950s America as an ideal or something, and now things are a bit bad because of the woke. Or the idea, alternatively, that things were kind of like bad and terrible, then the Enlightenment came along and everyone became a liberal, and reason and rationality took over, and that's why everything was good up until the 90s, and then a bunch of stuff happened and now things are kind of bad again. So there's kind of these stories and myths around an arc of moral progress. I think even like, Steven Pink has got that work, is it The Better Angels of Our Nature, I think, which is a kind of storytelling about this. And I wondered what your perspective is on that. What you've said a little bit about it, but if you could say a bit more about, this idea of there being this inevitable teleological arc or whatever towards goodness and betterness in these systems.
Yeah, and I think it's fascinating, right? Because what we've seen is many new atheists, who are not new obviously anymore, but like the former new atheists, jumping on that kind of bandwagon. But to me, sounds quite religious in a way. I mean, there's an element of really blind faith that is put in progress, and in liberal progress in particular, and the idea that we have to accept willingly and to submit ourselves to the fact that things are going to get better, and we shouldn't complain about things anymore. We just need to accept that progress is slow and things will be slow, and certain minorities shouldn't be pushing too much, because this is threatening the nature of our democracies. And again, this is interesting, because to me it's completely ahistorical, and yet it has such a grip on our societies, and to some extent on the left as well. Like many people have accepted that radical change is not possible anymore, that it needs to be incremental, that we need to compromise with people who want to dehumanize entire communities, in our countries or on our planet, and that's just the way forward. And I think this is, to me, deeply problematic, and I think we need to really push back against this idea of progress. And I think it's becoming clearer and clearer to many people that progress is not inevitable. But for a long time, we believed that progress would be inevitable, that eventually, women would earn as much as men, that minorities would have the same rights as others, that racism would die out when the older generations would die out, completely forgetting that all of this is about power. And so these kind of, we can push back on all of these kind of nasty ideologies and these nasty ideas, but we have to push back. They're not going to die on their own, right? We know, like, human beings are not evolving towards some kind of utopia that is completely yeah, I mean, there is an element of religion, I think, here, and of blind faith, and I'm not saying that necessarily in a negative way. I'm not saying that faith is negative automatically, but I find it quite ironic that quite often it's people who tend to be deeply anti-religious, because that allows them generally to be also deeply anti-Islamophobic, who then kind of have this kind of deep faith in a project that, from my point of view, is very, well, can lead towards authoritarianism, at least in many ways, and is very much in line with a lot of the reactionary resurgence we're seeing at this stage. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but tell me if I didn't.
Yeah. I think it was just. I mean, it was quite a high level question. To be fair, I just wanted to make sure that your views about this kind of theme that's going to come up, I think, in some of your concerns about things like racism being introduced in our politics is kind of like on the table as a big picture idea, and then maybe that'll come out in some of the questions further on. So I guess the case study for the book that I've looked at and some of the things that we're going to be looking at is the case of racism then in our politics. So one of the accounts that you give is of traditional racism. So what is traditional racism? And then I guess how would you like distinguish that from like liberal/illiberal racism? So maybe I can put that all in one question.
Yeah. So because I think it's hard to discuss them separately. So this comes from the work that I've done with my colleague Aaron Winter. So we started trying to kind of it wasn't to find a new way, right? We're building on a lot of literature, of course, that is absolutely influential for us on racism, on systemic racism in particular. But the first work we did together with Aaron back in the kind of mid 2010s was on Islamophobia, as we saw kind of Islamophobia being articulated in a way that allowed it to kind of attract a lot of people who would have considered themselves to be not racist, at least, and possibly even anti-racist. And so we wanted to understand how Islamophobia in a way can bring together like some people who are openly racist, like the extreme right, for example, and people who would consider themselves good liberals in a way, and they're just concerned about certain things. And we can come back to that in a second. And so we were trying to kind of find a way to first to understand it and then to make it understandable as well. And so what we came up with was like kind of three different articulations of racism. So the traditional articulation of racism would be the one that would kind of like be the more historical one, the one that would tap into biological races, for example, the one that kind of really started rising in the Middle Ages and then in the kind of 18th, 19th century. And so its heyday in the kind of like 19th century, and led to, of course, biological racism, anti-Semitism, and all of these kind of very kind of what we would call traditional racism, which then, the moral arc that we were talking about before would suggest was defeated at the end of the Second World War, when the Nazis were defeated, and then we didn't have racism anymore because the UN, put a charter out saying that everyone's equal and everything is fine. And so then that leads us to kind of a new, if you want, era of racism. Of course, racism hasn't disappeared, right? Again, to think that racism has gone is completely ahistorical. In straight after the Second World War, or even during the Second World War, the Allies were not anti-racist, and racism was very much pervasive in their politics. And empires still existed across the world, and racist policies were still very much official. Just to give an example, the White Australia policy, which is the first policy that Australia passed when they became independent in 1901, survived officially until 1972. Right, Australia was whiter in inverted commas in 1945 than it was in 1901. Because of how successful the kind of like racist policies in the country both turned against the indigenous populations and the people who had immigrated to Australia who were not white had been. So this continued officially until 1972, and of course there's a lot of other countries that have had ongoing kind of official racist policies in place: the US, the UK, and so on, France. And so what we try to understand in this kind of new era, in a way, the late kind of 20th century and in the early 21st century, is how can we understand these kind of different forms, different articulations of racism. And so what we came up with is illiberal and liberal articulations of racism. What we call illiberal articulations of racism are the ones that you find on the extreme right. So, for example, neo-Nazis, people who would go and put a swastika or tag a swastika on a synagogue, for example, people who would throw a pig's head at a mosque, people who would attack someone who is clearly part of a minority in the street, and so on, right? Or using kind of derogatory terms and so on. So that would be illiberal racism. The role of illiberal racism, as we see it, is of course to be incredibly hurtful to the people who are targeted, but it also serves another purpose. It serves a purpose in terms of justifying the more concealed forms of racism, the more systemic forms of racism, because we can point the finger at a bad egg, at an exception, at a horrible enemy, at a monster. And you see it quite often in the news, right? Recently, Elon Musk was called a monster in The Guardian, for example, or Trump is called a monster. And it's like, oh, it's horrible. These people are absolutely horrible. We're not like them. But actually, what we look at when we look at liberal racism is the way racism remains systemically ingrained in our institutions, and how illiberal racism allows us to ignore the less obvious forms of racism. And what we look at beyond that is also how certain liberal and even progressive tropes, terms, concepts can be used to push what we would consider racism. So, for example, we've looked at the way free speech has been used in the last decade, or maybe even more, to kind of push racism. The idea that we should be able to say anything, and if people are upset, so be it. This is what democracy is about. This is blah, blah, blah. And again, we could think about Elon Musk, but it's not just Elon Musk who says that. A lot of kind of well-meaning people have fallen for that argument. The idea that, yes, we should debate everything, and yes, people should be ready to kind of, fight it out in the marketplace of ideas. Another one that we've looked at is the way, for example, laïcité in France, which is secularism, this idea that France managed to separate church and state in the early 20th century, 1905, officially through a law that was passed. The way this kind of secularism has allowed the French elite to turn against Muslim communities and to justify laws that really would not be acceptable against any other minority or against any other people in France. So the idea, for example, that you can ban young women from wearing a hijab in schools, the idea that you can ban women from dressing however they want in the street. You wouldn't be able to say that to any other communities, but with Muslim people you can. And the justification is that France is a secular country and that's progressive. And so this is what we're kind of looking at in a way when we talk about liberal racism, these kind of more insidious forms that are couched in kind of progressive liberal terms that people are like, oh, actually, yeah, that makes sense, right? And so what we're trying to do is to show really how both liberal and illiberal articulations of racism are two sides of the same coin.
So would it be right in thinking that the traditional racism sort of has in it mostly sort of like a liberal racism, and it's these ideas more along the lines of, I mean, people might not have particular biological ideas, they might have like very low resolution ideas, but like basically skin color or background or culture, and maybe more sophisticated versions might be like eugenics and things like that. And then the liberal racism is that more the way that inequalities are perpetuated by like laws, systems, things that aren't necessarily individual actors with these ideas, but the way that those things are perpetuated by those systems. Or is that?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, absolutely. But also it is linked to discourse. So actors also perpetuate these kind of things, right? It's also, liberal racism is also how it makes us feel better about ourselves and about living in kind of racist societies, or it could also be, extended to other things as well. It could be extended to misogynist societies, patriarchal societies, all of these kind of things, right? Because it taps into things that others have talked about, like Charles Mills, for example, the racial contract, this idea that, or Bonilla Silva, when he talks about colorblind racism, for example, as well. It allows us to kind of pretend that we don't live in racist societies and that we don't benefit from racism anymore. This idea that the racist is the other, the racist is the kind of like, the neo-Nazi, the racist is the neo-fascist, the racist is Musk. It's not me benefiting from my colorblindness in a way and pretending that everything is fine and everyone has the same chance in life and so on.
So on sort of some of these topics, I've interviewed people about things like critical race theory before, which is another like big boogeyman of the heterodox right. So I wondered what your thoughts would be on a few objections that come to mind that some of these people would say to this kind of idea. So one initial objection that was in my mind was like the idea that, how do you know that it isn't like intent important? So maybe, you have these kind of like statistical constructs that show these outcomes, but how do you know that the best explanation of that is described as racism rather than it just being people falling to where they belong in a natural hierarchy or something like that, right? That was one sort of idea of an explanation. And then I've got a couple of others, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, well, that's a very convenient one, right? Because generally the people who would come up with that explanation are the people who fall at the top, right? So it's like, again, I mean, to me, this really kind of reminds me of the early bad faith argument about that we're core to biological racism. I mean, the people who kind of were most influential in defining kind of like the biological races back in the kind of 19th century. Think about de Gobineau and various others. They were like, oh, you have these races, and my race just happens to be at the top. Well, I mean, what are the chances, right? Like, it's funny that the people who came up with racist hierarchies always put themselves at the top. And it seems to me that the people who would come up with this kind of argument about critical race theory or racism being or these kind of like things that you're talking about not being related to racism, I think would conveniently be at the top as well. But of course, it's not just about racism as well. That's why I think a lot of critical race theorists talk about intersectionality as well. The idea that there are lots of kind of various contexts and forms of oppressions that then play a part in the way your chances are going to be impacted on. And so I mean what frustrates me about it all is that critical race theory, most basically, is not particularly threatening, right? It is an academic field, and it's one that is actually couched in a lot of kind of evidence, and it's very much evidence-based. It's not, it's interesting that it's become a boogeyman in a way, because when you look into it, it's actually not all that radical. It's all pretty obvious, and it's very well documented, and it's very, it's not the kind of arch communism that reactionaries dream of in many ways. So yeah.
Or even the Gnostic Christian heresy of James Lindsay describes. Right. So then another objection to this kind of way of looking at things might be, well, doesn't this take away, you're looking at like these systemic approaches, but it takes away the autonomy of these individuals to like have freedom over their, the freedom to self-determine their lives. It's kind of like this nanny state attitude where you should allow them to fail like adults. It's actually racist to think they can't stand on their own 2 feet, something like that.
Yeah, again, I mean, it's always very convenient for people to say that, because generally they're the ones who are not suffering from all these issues. I mean, it's not a question of being patronizing or anything like that. And it's not a question of saying that, people who are suffering from racism cannot do well, even in societies that are where the odds are stacked against them. The point is like, if you believe in, it goes back to the argument about free speech, right? When we get free speech absolutists like Elon Musk telling us, oh, well, everyone used to be able to say whatever they want, or Zuckerberg now, with Meta and Facebook, we need to remove all the safeguards, and, people should be able to say whatever they want. It's like, I'm sorry, but free speech is not democratic if you don't have equal speech, or if you don't have equal access to speech. If someone has 1 billion followers and billions of dollars, and even compared to me as an academic who has a little bit of access to public discourse, that the odds are stacked here in someone's favor. So it's all nice and well, but if you can talk above people, and if you can talk while other people are silenced, these silenced people can say whatever they want in their head. It has no impact. There's no, there might be free speech, but there's no equal speech. And if you don't have equal speech, you don't have democracy. And this is very similar, right? This is a question of like, yeah, level the playing field, and then let's see who succeeds and who doesn't, right? Let's see who benefits from the racial contract, from the sexual contract, and so on, and then we can see where people end up. So it's like, it's not patronizing at all, because it's not about the people who are suffering from racism, from patriarchy, from capitalist inequalities, not being able to actually achieve incredibly well. The point is that they are being prevented from achieving to the best of their ability, because some other people are too fragile to actually give up on their privilege.
And then the last objection to this way of viewing things that I'm going to bring up now is the idea that implicit in this way of like systems thinking about prejudices is a kind of reverse racism or something. It's like, look, the thing that makes racism wrong is that you're classifying people on their skin color or demographics or something, rather than the content of their character. But you're actually all in favor of that in some special context. So isn't this just a case of reverse racism, something like that?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And well, no, it's not, because again, like, when I talk about racism, for example, the racism is not about the person who is suffering from racism. It's very much about the racist person, and it's about the person who has the gaze, in a way, the person who brings racist characteristics to a particular group of people and this particular group of people can be defined in many different ways, right? You could think, for example, of asylum seekers, or you could think about Muslim people. These people end up having particular characteristics, or Jewish people, for example. These people end up having particular characteristics, racist characteristics, not because of their individual traits, but because of the way they are seen by the racist. So, if you end up being seen as Black, as Jewish, as an asylum seeker, and not as a Muslim person, you will become homogenized as this category. And so these kind of like traits will be imposed on you. The idea that you might be more kind of criminally involved, the idea that you might be lazy, the idea that you might be this and that, right? And so in a way, this is not about, applying these distinctions to people. It's about looking at the way the gaze of certain people who have particular power, the impact of this gaze on their chances in a way, and the way systems have naturalized that. I mean, again, lots of research has been done on how it is a lot more difficult for certain people because of these racialized characteristics to find a place to rent, to find a job, to get a loan, to get access to medicine, and so on and so forth. All of this is incredibly well documented. So it's not a question of saying that this is because they are who they are. It's because of the way who they are is seen in a particular way.
So in your book, Reactionary Democracy, you talk about, well, it could be you or your co-author as well, I should say, talk about how political ideas go from being sort of like taboo to mainstream. This idea of like the mainstreaming of ideas that were once seen as like delegitimate is a part of the mechanism of how democracy doesn't have this kind of like inevitable arc towards better kind of like outcomes. So what's the story of how that works, I guess? Like how do these political ideas go from being taboo to mainstream?
Yeah, I mean, this has been really key to our work, and Aaron and I have been working a lot on this idea of mainstreaming and the mainstream, something we've then developed with Katie Brown as well since, and she's done some brilliant work on that, on trying to define the mainstream, which is something that very few people in politics have done, and that even Aaron and I didn't necessarily do as precisely as she ended up doing it. So if you're interested in that, I really encourage you to check out our work. So what we really like, what we were struck with Aaron at first was when we were working on Islamophobia and on liberal and illiberal Islamophobia, and we wanted to understand how ideas are moving in a way. How it's not just about the extreme right or the far right, it's also about how these ideas can then become normalized, these ideas can become accepted. How is it that certain mainstream parties, even sometimes on the left, will end up lapping up, arguments about anti-immigration, for example, the idea that we need to close the borders, the idea that we need to kind of like send people away when they're claiming asylum, the idea that, things that we know are simply not true, right? Things that we know are not only not true, but will help the far right legitimize their views. And so we wanted to kind of look at that. And so what we ended up kind of looking at in a way is it's very much this arc that you're talking about, and how it's become kind of mythical and this kind of fantasy where we think that the mainstream is good, that it's reasonable, and the problem is the far right. And the far right, if we can contain it, will be okay. But what we're arguing with Aaron is that actually, the borders between the far right and the mainstream are fuzzy, and they can move, right? And what we're arguing is that progress is not inevitable, as we discussed before. That what is mainstream one day doesn't have to be mainstream the next. And this is very obvious stuff, right? I mean, none of what we write is particularly actually radical or original to an extent. It's what we're trying to do with our work is really to kind of highlight some of the kind of myths that we've lapped up that are shaping our societies into deeply unequal societies and sending us towards authoritarianism. So, let's say, for example, let's look, for example, at same-sex marriage. 20, 30 years ago, in a lot of societies, it would have seemed completely insane to believe that you would have same-sex marriage one day, and then it became completely natural to think that you would have same-sex marriage. And now we're seeing that actually, well, things are moving the other way around, right? These rights are being threatened. And so what we're arguing is that, just like progress can happen, just like we can fight reactionary politics, we can fight inequality, we can move towards more equality, we can move the other way around as well. And what we're seeing at the moment is this backlash in a way, and how some people are losing rights, and as soon as people lose rights, more people might lose rights. And what we're seeing is that the mainstream here is not a bulwark. Like, the mainstream is not necessarily protecting us. The mainstream can turn reactionary if it sees a benefit in it, or if it sees that its survival depends on that as well. And that's what we're seeing with a lot of kind of social media billionaires at the moment. They know that rallying behind Trump is in their interest, and so all of their kind of so-called care about EDI, so-called care about progress, about being woke, is dropping completely, and the masks are falling, which I think should have always been pretty obvious, to be honest. But anyway.
So in the case of racism, I guess you kind of like look at the UK and how some of this discourse around race became more a part of became more mainstream. I'm not quite sure of the right, because there's a few sub questions that kind of come up under this in the book, I guess. So one of them was like, this idea of it being like the working class or the populist point of view to be racist, and that was like a little bit of the kind of like mechanism for how some of this stuff got mainstreamed. But then I guess maybe before that, it's worth talking about like what populism is, if that would be useful for as an inroad to that topic. Happy to kind of like go at it whichever angle you think is best.
Yeah. I think, I think these 2 points are linked, right? I mean, populism is something that I've worked a lot on over the years, building on the work of other people, like in particular Annie Collowald in France, who unfortunately her book in 2004 was never translated, and it's a real shame because translated into English at least, which is a real shame because I think it made very clear a lot of things that still don't seem to be clear when we talk about populism. Her argument was that populism had become used as a euphemization of far-right racist politics in many ways. And what's fascinating about the history of how populism becomes used to euphemize far-right politics is that it's far-right politicians who impose it, who suggest it. So populism has a fairly long history. I don't want to bore you or your listeners, but so I'll say it very quickly in case people don't know. But it's something that I'm quite fascinated with personally. So I mean, the term populism really emerges in the late 18th century, both in the US and in Russia, into very different kind of movements. So in the US, it was the movement against monopolies, and partly rail monopolies, and it was quite a left-wing movement that ends up being kind of like hijacked by the Democrats and folded into the Democratic Party. In Russia, it's a movement that was turned more towards the peasantry, quite radical again, the idea that the peasants were the people, and they would be the ones rising up and overthrowing the Tsar. That didn't work out, and that led to a lot of lessons learned by the Bolsheviks, who then believed in kind of more a working class kind of revolution in a way. So these were kind of the populist forms of politics. Then populism comes back in the second part of the 20th century, particularly we see it in Latin America, and we see it kind of coming back a little bit in other places. But then it makes also a comeback in other settings in the 1980s and 90s, when the far right tries to reinvent itself. And so what they try to do is to no longer be called extreme right, to no longer be called fascist, racist, and so on. And so what they try to push is the word populism. And Jean-Marie Le Pen, the leader of a far-right Front National in France, who passed away a week ago, who was an anti-Semite, a Holocaust denial, who had tortured people in Algeria, who had supported the fascist Vichy regime in France, like a really kind of nasty piece of work, who created this Front National, who now is one of the biggest parties in France, led by his daughter. Jean-Marie Le Pen in 1991 tried to kind of push the term populism to make his party called Populist, right? And what's fascinating is quite quickly the media, academics lap it up and start using the term populism, and of course that's great, right? Because if you ask a far right leader who has the whole baggage of the Nazis, the whole baggage of fascism, whether rightly or wrongly associated to them, if you ask them whether they'd rather be called fascist, racist, far right, or populist, of course they'll want to be called populist. And there's a very good reason for that. Is it doesn't have such a nasty baggage, although many people think of it as an insult. It's not, because it links them to the people, and it gives them this kind of idea, this kind of aura that they're speaking for the people. And not only they're speaking for the people, but they're speaking for the little people, for the people that are not being listened to, against the elite, which is of course ridiculous, because as I said at the start, far-right politics are deeply elitist. Far-right politicians don't care about the people. And you can see that very clearly through their economic policies, for example. Their economic policies are not driven towards better equality, towards workers' rights, towards giving people more freedom and so on. No, it's not. It's deeply, deeply elitist. But by calling them populist, we give them a democratic sense of legitimacy almost. The idea that in the post-democracies that we live in, where the center-left and the center-right are pretty much the same, and they clearly don't listen to us, we're giving them the label of populist, where somehow they are representing the people who they can claim to be. So populism is, from my point of view, is super interesting as an academic topic, but I think it should really be banned in public discourse, to be honest, because I think it does a lot more harm than it clarifies anything, really. So that leads me then to the point about the working class, because
it's maybe just because a question that kind of came up related to some of the things you were saying here then is like, again, a kind of very common interaction between people with different political points of view is that, someone will kind of say something that is clearly signaling to the in-group what they believe, but maybe it's kind of like couched in cautious terms, but it might be something about certain races or, the Jews or something like that. And, someone might get frustrated by that and say, oh, so, I basically accuse you of the person of being a fascist, right? I can think of a good way that they might do that. But and then they'll say, oh, well, I'm not technically a fascist, right? Because fascism means, either they'll refer specifically to Mussolini and his beliefs, or they'll be like, oh no, I'm fine with Christian nationalists, but fascist, no, like you're just wrong or something. And you end up having this semantic discussion about the meaning of the term fascism, which kind of completely blunts the force of what you were trying to do, which is point out that something someone said is like very, very bad or has very, very bad implications, right? But in terms of what you were saying about using less loaded terms, like maybe populist is one of an example of a less loaded term. It seems like if we accept what you say there, then we won't use those kind of less loaded terms. So what would be the right terms to use for people with these extreme kind of views, in your view?
Yeah, I mean, and look, you're pointing to something that is, I think, very, very important, right? And in a way, the far right has done very well at manipulating these kind of debates, and in a way, a lot of kind of mainstream media, whether left or right, liberal or whatever you want to call it, as broadsheets and so on, they've taken the easy way out. So when they use populist, they don't get any complaints, they don't get any pushback, like from the far right. And when they use far right, when they use fascist, then they get pushback. We had this case recently in the UK, for example, when the BBC called the Reform UK, which is a far right party here, when they called them far right, and Reform UK complained to the BBC, threatened them to sue them, and the BBC apologized. And it was fascinating because a day later, or maybe that evening even, I can't remember, the editor of a media I was working with in the UK sent me an email saying, look, I'm sorry, but we won't be able to call Reform a far-right party anymore because the BBC sets the tone, right? And I said, okay, well, that's interesting. But then an independent journalist reached out to me and I said, well, look, I'm really annoyed about it, so I'd like to write an article for a small kind of liberal kind of a website, and I'd like to quote you saying, as an academic, that Reform is a far-right party, right? And so I gave them a quote, and in the article it says, well, Aurelien Mondon, senior lecturer at the University of Bath, disagrees, and he believes that Reform is far-right because X, Y, and Z. And they ran it past the legal team at this outlet, and the legal team accepted it, said, yeah, there's no risk, and there was no backlash at all. So again, you can see how, in a way, the fear of backlash from the far right ends up driving the agenda almost. That the media will be like, I'll call them populist because if I call them far right, I'm going to get an email and that's going to be annoying. So I'll just call them populist and then they'll leave me alone. But then we end up playing them at their game, right? So to go back to your question more precisely, how do we call them? Well, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter, right, how we call them. What we shouldn't call them is things that they want to be called, in a way, unless what they want to be called is accurate. Populist is not accurate by any serious definition. You could call them far right, you could call them extreme right, you could call them fascist, racist, ultra-nationalist if you want. I have my preferences, for example. You can find our definitions in the book. But at the end of the day, that's not necessarily what matters. I think what we need to call them is things that are accurate enough. If there's backlash, then we shouldn't listen to them, because they should not be setting the agenda. They should not be framing the way we talk about them, just like other parties shouldn't be framing the way we talk about them. Right? If they don't want to be called racist, then don't be a racist, right? If you don't want to be called a fascist, then don't be a fascist. That's the easiest way, right? Rather than semantically arguing about what fascism is or not. Again, what's interesting as well is then, we go into rabbit holes. So I think what we need to do is to avoid debating the far right in many ways. And that's one of the things that was one of my bugbears, these kind of like debates between left-wing liberal people and far-right people that are trying to convince each other. While the far right is never participating in a debate in a good faith manner. It's always bad faith. What they want is to put their ideas into the mainstream. What they want is the platform to make their ideas respectable. We shouldn't make these ideas respectable because these people have no interest in actually debating us. These people have an interest in dehumanizing certain communities and bringing inequality forward.
Yeah, that point I think could be expanded a lot more. I'd be very interested in empirical data around it. What platforming or having a debate does on, like, say, a contested issue? Like, does it legitimize a point of view that's previously seen as extreme to, like, to the average audience member or something? I don't know where I sit on that. Like, I see the argument you're making. I don't. The question of, like, responsible platforming versus, like, having legitimate experts on to show why certain views are false, versus, obviously I'm against, like, something like what maybe Joe Rogan or Lex Friedman does, where they might have, here's a guy who denies vaccines work, here's a guy that says they do. It's like 50-50 should be your prior or something going into that debate. No, that's clearly, a mistake. But I don't know where I stand on stuff like that. So maybe if we park that conversation, just
we can. Sorry, I could go on for like on this for ages, but go ahead.
So to go back to then this idea of the working class and racism in the UK. So I guess it was kind of the idea is that the sort of branding, right, was that these are views that are held by the common people. That's what we are, the populists. We represent the people, and this is just your ordinary bloke down the pub, what they believe and what they'd have to say about these issues, and then you kind of like explore whether or not that's true a bit, I guess, in your book, particularly the UK case.
Yeah, that's right. And we look at the UK, the US, and France, and what we realize is that there are very similar trends in many ways, where the rise of reactionary politics, the rise of the far right, whether it's Trump, whether it's Farage, whether it's Le Pen in France, is blamed on the little people, if you want, and particularly on the working class, in brackets, the white working class. So, it's blamed on the working class. The assumption is the white working class, also called the left behind, all of these kind of things. People with legitimate interests, whether it's the Rust Belt in the US, whether it's the Red Wall in the UK, they use lots of metaphors to kind of, refer to these people. And what we've looked at really with Aaron, building on other research, again, people who have done it far better than we could in a way, because we are not necessarily people who look at surveys all that much, but building on their work, building on our own work as well, looking at kind of various kind of narratives that can be put forward to explain the election of Donald Trump, or the victory of a Brexit referendum in the UK, or the rise of the Rassemblement National in France and Marine Le Pen. What we ended up finding out is that actually, there's different ways to look at it, right? There's no denying that some of the working class votes for reactionaries. It's always been the case. In fact, in France and in the UK, there's always been a third of the working class, at the very least, who voted right-wing, right? So there's always been part of the working class that has voted for the right, that has voted for the far right, and so on. This is nothing new. But what we looked at is that actually, when we look at the US, when we look at the UK, and France, a big chunk of the vote for far right ideas, for far right parties, comes from people who are actually quite wealthy. And so, of course, it depends on how you define the working class. And the working class can be defined in a lot of different ways. Looking at the UK, for example, it's not particularly useful the way we define the working class through surveys, because it kind of puts together a lot of different people who might have been working class one day but might not be. So, for example, let's imagine, right, if you're 65, you're retired in the UK, but you had a working class job most of your life, you're probably living quite comfortably, because you did earn quite a bit of money. You were able to buy a house quite early on in your life, and then you had some kind of capital that allowed you to kind of live comfortably. You have a good pension and so on. But if you're 25 and you might be well educated, but you're working on a not in a great job, because there's no great jobs, you can't buy a house because it's completely unaffordable nowadays. Who's the working class there? Is it the woke 25-year-old who's a barrister? Who has no prospect in life, or is it the 65-year-old who has a house, maybe another house in Spain, and and a comfortable pension, who just rages at gender neutral toilets, right? And so I think there's been a kind of misconceptions of what the working class is in many ways, and we've seen that kind of being internalized by various actors in the media, in academia, in political parties as well. And so now when they talk to the people, or to the working class, they talk to this kind of tiny minority of reactionary kind of white supremacists, I would call them, or kind of reactionaries really, that are not a lot, but are generally well off, and that drive the agenda, which to my point of view is really mind-blowing. I mean, if you look at Trump in 2016, his vote came predominantly from wealthy parts of well, not wealthy parts of the US necessarily, but wealthy sections of the population. And it got even worse in 2020. It reversed a bit in 2024 from I haven't done as much research in 2024 as I did on 2020 and 2016 on this. But again, this is a wealthy vote. And of course it is a wealthy vote. Why wouldn't it be? These kind of politics benefit wealthy people. They tend to be low tax. They tend to be less regulation. So they benefit wealthy people and racist people. So it's not the class thing that's going to get them to vote for the far right. It's racism or it's actually wealth generally.
And not that you have to necessarily respond to this, but I can hear in the chat, but the Hispanic vote or something, there's always, the problem with all of these discussions is that to really assess the causal explanations, you have to spend a lot of time going into the details about what's going on, right, to figure out what's true.
Of course, and also you have to look at context, right, and you have to look at how these things become self-fulfilling prophecies, right? If you keep telling certain people that actually the only voice that's defending them is this crazy kind of far right leader, then they might end up being convinced. And so there are things. The Latino vote in the US is a tricky one because what we saw in 2020 in particular was the shift when Trump got more Latino votes in 2020. A lot of it was down to Florida as well, and so it's a very different kind of Latino vote that is very anti-communist. So his anti-communism propaganda played a role in that. As I said, I haven't looked so much in 2024, but of course it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And also it's also a question of hierarchies, right? It's where are you in the hierarchies of races that are created by racism, and where do you feel you are in all of this, and who do you feel is going to serve your interests best? And so I think again, it's not about kind of like skin color. It's about racialized communities in many ways, and who manages to tap into these kind of things. But I think that one of the real dangers is that this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy when it becomes lapped up by mainstream media, by mainstream politicians and so on, and everyone starts talking about the left behind and how much harder it is to be part of a white working class, or then people kind of end up buying it, and that's a real danger.
So just conscious of time, because we're coming up to an hour, by the way, there's quite a few questions that people have put in at the minute, but also there's a couple more that kind of follow the arc of the book. So I don't know whether you would want to jump to questions from people who've been listening in, just in the interest of time, or if you want to go through the final questions. I'm not offended either way, just want to be respectful of your time.
No, that's fine. Look, I'm not in any particular rush, so really enjoying it. So happy to go through your question first and then the others if you want. Okay. I mean, it's up to you as well, obviously.
Great. So then I guess there's this idea then of the binary that's created of the establishment versus the populists, right? And so why is this binary created? Is it a real binary? Should we think so? So.
Yeah, absolutely. It is a real binary. And that's one of the things that frustrates me about what I call in my work with colleagues populist hype, is that it's completely denaturing the potential of populist politics in many ways. Populist politics at the end of the day is the construction of a people versus an elite. And, there's lots of ways where this is applicable. We have an elite that controls our communication, our media, our politics. We have professional politicians nowadays. They are less and less representative. We have professional media that are less and less representative as well. All of these kind of things, right? We have less and less access to public media, to local media, to all of these kind of things. Academics are incredibly kind of all come from similar backgrounds as well. Not all, of course. When I say all, it's not everyone comes from, but many academics come from. Yeah, right. Thank you. I don't want some of your listeners to complain and say that this is not accurate, statistically. Anyway, point is, we live in increasingly oligarchic and technocratic societies. The vast majority of people have less and less control over democracy, have less and less choice about the way our societies are changing, how our societies are changing, and what to do about it. So I think, populism, of course, there is a space for it, and we saw it, for example, flare up at various moments, like the 1% versus the 99% in Occupy Wall Street, and you see it in various other places. So I think the problem with populist hype and the way it's been associated with the far right is it has prevented almost to criticize the elite. Because if you criticize the elite, you're like Trump. or if you criticize the elite, you like Nigel Farage, or you like Marine Le Pen, and you become associated with these people. And we've seen it in the media, for example, in France in particular, where the left-wing alternative is compared to the far-right alternatives and like put in the same, in the same under the same term populism. And we've seen it with Bernie Sanders as well, and Trump, and so this is deeply problematic because I think populism has a role to play. I think we live in deeply elitist societies and that's why they are deeply unequal in a way. So I think populism could be useful, but I think unfortunately it's been denatured so much that I try to refrain from using it in public discourse.
The last question then is your thoughts on how people can sort of curb and combat reactionary democracy then, because obviously there's a lot of continued polarizing politics, normalization of various previous taboos along various lines. So what can people do?
Well, I think we need to stop being scared of being radical in a way, right? And I think in a way there's a lesson to learn from the far right and from reactionaries is that they haven't been scared of being radical. The difference between them and us is that they have a lot of money. They are the elite. They are a different elite to the one in power right now, but they have much more in common with the current elite than they do with the rest of us, right? But I think we need to be more radical. I think we need to stop voting for the least worst, to borrow from Lorna Finlayson. We need to stop accepting that our current mainstream liberal elite, whatever you want to call it, is going to be a bulwark against the far right. They've shown very clearly that they're not going to be a bulwark. I think what we need to demand is proper democracy. I think what we need to demand is that things change for the better and for everyone, which is, according to a lot of surveys, what people want. And again, we need to be careful with the way we look at surveys, because people don't answer surveys in a vacuum. They don't answer surveys without kind of thinking about what is shaping their lives and so on. And it's something that Aaron and I have done quite a lot of work on, when it comes to the immigration issue. People believe that immigration is an issue when they think about their country, but when they think about their day-to-day lives, they don't see immigration as a problem. Because of course, when they think about their day-to-day lives, they don't think about the immigrant, because the immigrant is their neighbor, it's their pharmacist, it's their it's their teacher, it's the parents of their children, whatever, of the parents of their friends, of their children's friends, and so on, right? So when they think about their day-to-day lives, they think about education, they think about health, they think about pensions, they think about jobs, they think about the economy, they think about things that impact them. And that's why, we need to change these narratives. We need to kind of create, and it's super hard, right? I don't have any easy solutions to that, but we need to create a democratic space where ideas are shared equally, where we have a level playing field when it comes to speech, rather than just free speech. We need equal speech. These are the starting points, and we need to fight back against the hijacking of potentially progressive concepts like democracy by reactionary forces.
Yeah, I think that's possibly where it comes back to some of the things you were mentioning earlier in the conversation about like free speech and the way that kind of discourse has been hijacked, right? Because some of these kind of classical liberal people, I've been fairly critical of them and tried to have conversations with them where, so I can kind of like highlight to their audiences some of the problems with their views. And I have been systematically cancelled in my attempts. So on one occasion, I met up with one of the people in London and had a conversation. They never released the footage. I tried to call into their live stream. They saw it was me and kicked me out. Then one of them then just banned me on Substack, and then a GB News reporter who's friends with them banned me on Substack as well, so I couldn't comment on their things anymore. And their kind of defense here is, look, in a free marketplace, I don't have to buy your goods. But I think that, there's a number of criticisms to go with there. First, the metaphorical adoption of marketplace, right? Mm-hmm. But then, insofar as that's an example of the marketplace working, then that's a clear example of why we don't want a free marketplace in the case of free speech, because you're able to, the discourse then just degenerates into who is able to attract your attention, McDonald's mush, rather than good ideas about any of these things.
Absolutely. I think, to go back to the point about debate and whether we should debate the far right, one of the things that has always struck me is that whenever I criticize some left-wing media, liberal media, center-left media for platforming far-right people, they are much more comfortable platforming these far-right people than engaging with me and my colleagues, for example. So, you can see again, these kind of things, I don't like the term fragility, because I think it's been applied in ways that I think are not particularly helpful. But I think psychologically, on an individual level, I think there's an element of fragility that I just find absolutely fascinating. This idea that the refusal to contemplate that radical change is necessary while pretending that you believe in good. so you just want the pat on the back for being on the right side without doing any effort to actually change anything. So it's a hell of a drug.
I've seen it also described as like civility porn on a lot of these podcasts, where people will talk about how much they love debating the ideas and all that, but they will never, in fact, challenge each other's views. They just kind of like get these milquetoast agreement on all it. So
we need to remain friends.
So Doug Pine Creek asks, does Aurelien support Sharia law? If not, could someone call him an Islamophobe?
No. I mean, why would I support Sharia law? I mean, also, does Pine Creek know what Sharia law is? And also, why? And if I don't support Sharia law, why would I be an Islamophobe? Also, I could be Muslim, to be honest. I'm not sure Pine Creek knows that or not, but I think it's a very weird assumption to make. I don't really understand that.
I'm not certain. I'm guessing it's part of some like reductio setup of something that you said about racism earlier, but I don't know.
I think so. But I think it's it's an interesting thing as well. What I just find fascinating about Islamophobia, and again, it's something that we look at a lot with Aaron, is like Islamophobia was ripe for the peaking in a way when the far right was trying to reinvent itself, because a lot of kind of far right people were claiming, and a lot of the new atheists were claiming that they were not talking about racism. It was not about race. It's about religion, right? And we should be able to talk about religion, except it's never about religion. They don't know anything about Sharia law. They don't know about anything about Islam. And even if they did, we're talking about more than 1 billion people around the earth, and all of them have very different ways to go about their religion. We would never expect all Christians to have the same understanding of the Bible. We would never expect, other religions to be completely homogenized. And if we did, then that would be racism. The point is, you can criticize a religion, you can criticize a religious text, that's theology, that's absolutely fine. The problem, it becomes racism when you homogenize every person who believes in that particular kind of religion, which is absolutely ridiculous, and it shouldn't have to be stated anymore. So I'm sorry, Pine Creek, but if you don't want to be called an Islamophobe, don't be an Islamophobe.
Yeah, and I've actually been meaning to have guests on who are experts in extremism as well, because I know a lot of people who are, again, into like the religion side of the debate sort of very uncritically adopt people like Sam Harris's perspectives, or more recently people like Richard Dawkins, and then a lot of experts in the psychology and sociology and anthropology behind extremism have kind of like written very starkly against Sam and said, look, why don't you engage with our explanations? Why don't you? Because Sam likes to explain it in terms of like Islamic doctrine, but then it just doesn't really like fit to the data very well.
No,
like
of course not.
And all these things.
But you can see how it works, right? Because it's like everyone, again, it's part of that liberal arc that we were talking about, this idea that we overcome, with the Enlightenment, we've overcome kind of religion. Now it's all about science, all of this kind of things. So religion is this kind of boogeyman as well. So it's kind of nice to kind of, punch down on religion in a way, or at least some of it, or at least some particular interest, right? And as long as it's punching down, obviously.
Blam-tasticful asks, what does Aurelien make of people citing IQ research based on Charles Murray's bell curve? Would you classify that under, like, how would that fit in your classification of racisms?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, I mean, again, this is not my expertise, right? But there's a lot of very good research on that, and we touch on this a little bit in the book. IQ, I mean, IQ tests, things like that, they can be fun, but they are deeply inaccurate. They are not scientific at all, and they have been used massively to kind of push racist theories. So I'm not saying that everyone who believes in IQ tests or whatever is necessarily a racist or has necessarily ill intent, but you can quite clearly see how that can tap into kind of racist discourse and racist ideas. And yet Charles Murray's book is very problematic about this. And it's not just about racism as well, it's about classism to an extent as well. It's about kind of like, excluding people from having certain rights or from having certain demands. So, it's about sexism as well, misogyny and so on.
So Pine Creek asks, does Aurelien believe some cultures are better than others? If so, can he give a specific example?
Well, I mean, what is a culture? I mean, I'm sorry, but it's ridiculous, right? Like, it's like, okay, look, I'm French. Does that mean I'm like the 65 million French people there? I don't know how many French people there are. I think 65, 70 million. That doesn't mean I'm exactly the same, right? I mean, my brother is allergic to cheese. Does that make him not French? Because France is French people eat cheese. Like, what is a culture? That's absolutely ridiculous. Again, if you're trying to homogenize a culture and pretend that everyone who kind of belongs to or says they belong to this culture is exactly the same, it's absolutely ridiculous, right? It's, not everyone is American the same way, not everyone is British the same way, not everyone is Muslim the same way. If you're homogenizing an entire group of people, pretending that they're all the same or they share all the same characteristics and beliefs, then you're just trying to justify your own prejudice, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I think that to put Doug's rhetorical strategy on the table, I think that any kind of nuanced or long answer to a question like that is a concession of guilt, right? So he wants a simple. He wants you to.
But gotcha. Yeah. I mean, look, I'm so used to these kind of things, and it's like it just blows my mind. It's like, do you really think that you're being clever? Like,
so. Coril asks, how do we identify who is truly in the far right? I see the left often overuses far right, much like the right overuses communists to label anyone they disagree with.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's tricky. I mean, my point is, one of the things that I tell, I teach these things obviously as well. I talk to students about it, and what I tell them is, like, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter whether someone is far right or not. To be honest, is Trump a fascist? I don't care. Is Elon Musk a fascist, far right, extreme right? I don't care either, because then it becomes a debate between he said, she said, right? Like, Musk would say, oh, I'm not, I'm a libertarian, whatever. I mean, that's what we were talking about before, right? This idea that people then get into semantic debates. I'm not interested in that. What I'm interested in is the consequences of speech, right? And the consequences of people's actions. Is Trump far right? I don't care. What Trump does, though, what Trump says is definitely far right and pushing far right politics, right? Whether he believes in what he's doing or not doesn't matter, right? So I think that's the first point. I think we shouldn't exaggerate. Yeah, if someone is just being simply conservative, we shouldn't probably call them far right. I agree, and sometimes it can be thrown as an insult. Fascism has been thrown as an insult. And that's why it's made it a lot easier to use the term today, and it's making a comeback, because I think we've reached a point where it's really hard to not see the resurgence of fascism. But that has been a problem, I think, of the fact that fascism has been thrown carelessly around. So yeah, I do see your point, and I think we need to be more careful with
that. Frank S, is opposing immigration always racist in your view?
Yeah, that's a great question. And look, I don't know if it's always racist. I think it's misguided always, because I think opposing immigration stems from a misunderstanding of power, of history, and of privilege in many ways, right? I think also it's a question of diversion. The immigration issue is always an issue of diversion, right? It's pitting people who are clearly suffering, who are trying to get themselves a better life, against people who are worried, feel vulnerable, rightly or wrongly, so that the people who actually get benefit out of it all keep benefiting out of it all. So I think what we need to do is, instead of focusing on immigration, is focusing on who actually is making us insecure, who is making us worried, who is making our jobs threatened, who is controlling the means of production, and so on, right? So, it doesn't matter whether it is racist or not. It's just a really unhelpful diversion, which then, of course, kind of serve some people who hold racist views as well, right? Whether everyone who opposes immigration is racist or not, again, it's neither here nor there, but it certainly serves racist purposes, which then end up dividing people who should be fighting together for a better world and better life.
I think the people most motivated to ask questions are people who disagree with you as well, by the way. I don't know.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm used to that, as I said, on social media, so I'm sure there'll be a few comments there too, so that's cool.
So this one was, does being against twisting history by color washing historical figures make one racist? Can you consistently be against whitewashing but in favor of blackwashing? I think the question might be a little bit loaded in this case. But
yeah, look, I don't know. I think, again, you may think you're very clever using the word blackwashing. I think it's ridiculous, and I think you need to kind of think about power a little bit more, right? I mean, it's up to you. Side with reactionaries, side with power. It doesn't make you brave. It makes you a reactionary. That's it. Fine, do whatever you want, right? I'm not canceling you. But you're just siding with power. What do you want me to say?
Chris Perdue asks, how do we be tolerant without tolerance of intolerance? So the kind of Popper paradox of tolerance thing, I think.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I mean, it's a good question. I don't know whether it's asked in good faith or not, but I'll take it as if it was asked in good faith.
I think it was. I think
Yeah.
I think there's maybe 3 very vocal people who oppose you in chat, but I think this is a good faith.
Okay, so I won't become cynical then. And look, in that case, if it's asked in good faith, I think it's a very good question. I think, look, there are moments where we need to draw a line, right? And my point of view is you need to draw a line when the humanity of certain communities is being threatened, right? When the rights, the kind of given human rights of certain communities are being threatened, and this is when we need to stop. And this is when we need to. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't study what the intolerants are saying, but we don't have to give them a platform. Going back to our kind of conversation about debate and so on, we don't have to give them a platform to deconstruct what they're saying and to show how harmful it is. Instead, what we should do is to talk to the communities at the sharp end of this intolerance. We should talk to the experts. We should talk to the people who actually want to create a better world, rather than listening to the intolerant saying their intolerant things we've already heard many, many times. And we know they have no interest in changing their mind, right? So let's combat it instead. Doesn't mean we can't study it, doesn't mean we can't talk about it, but we don't need to hear it over and over again, because it's also incredibly traumatic for the people at the sharp end of this politics to see their identities being dehumanized constantly.
Crispy Jew confirms it was asked in good faith.
I appreciate it, and I'm sorry I was cynical.
And then, but another definitely good faith question was you quickly answer questions.
But yeah, I did quickly answer what is race. What is race? It's a construction. It's a construction to justify oppression. I mean, what kind of gotcha is that? It's a ridiculous question.
I think the idea to do the Steelman thing is like that when it came to using a word like race, which might be difficult to operationalize or something, you didn't talk about the complexity of how the word applies, but answered using the term. But when it comes to culture, you talked about the complexity of the term rather than answering or something. And so is there an inconsistency in your beliefs or something?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there is. I think it's pretty clear, and I think I can answer both these questions very quickly. What is culture? Well, it's a construction. What is race? It's a construction. They're both discursive constructions, and they're both there to kind of bring people together and exclude people.
Great. And then I'm just having a look in the chat for other questions that haven't been answered. That might be. I don't think I've missed any. Oh, and that banner can be gone as well. So, hang on, where have I gone? Sorry, I've navigated myself to the wrong place. We asked that one about immigration. There was this one about. Well, I guess it comes back to a question I was thinking about answering. Someone asked a question with respect to the stuff that's happened these past couple of weeks with Musk in the news, right? Mm-hmm. So my version of the question that I put as like a potential one to ask was about the way that Musk basically promoted a bunch of this news around like free Tommy Robinson and stuff, and screenshots of letters of MPs voting in certain ways as if they were voting directly against arresting Muslim rape gangs or something like mm-hmm. that. And then the way that that's been received as Musk being a hero in the UK, and the removal of all kind of like nuance from the ability of people to sort of think, well, is it consistent to, for example, be against information warfare, but also say be in favor of an inquest in this case or something, or be, is that mm-hmm. People's inability to sort of like really think about the particular topic because it's such a hot button issue and they're being like manipulated by the information space. And it's something like that. Does that fall under your paradigm of reactionary politics and the attempt to basically normalize like flooding the zone with shit? And then if so, how should we respond to these kind of examples as they happen?
Yeah, and look, I mean, that's the thing. That's how they muddy the waters, right? Because of course, no one wants to see children being abused and so on, right? Like, and of course, people need to be brought to justice for doing these kind of things, and much more needs to be done. But the fact of the matter is, again, it goes back to bad faith arguments. Why does Elon Musk care about this particular case and not about others, right? Why does Tommy Robinson care about this when he doesn't really care about young people normally, and young women in particular? Why does Kemi Badenoch, the leader of a Conservative Party, care about this all of a sudden? sudden when she was in the government for many years before, and they did absolutely nothing. The point is that they're trying to turn this into a racist argument when it's very much a classist argument. The fact is the police in this country, in the UK, is not helping certain people, for sure, but we know that, right? And it's about class, it's about race, it's about all of this. Yes, there is two-tier policing, and not the way the far right wants to believe there is two-tier policing. There is two-tier policing in terms of, some people do not deserve to be protected, clearly, in our system, right? Yeah, so tackle that, fight power. That's not what Musk is doing. That's not what Tommy Robinson is doing. And again, I just find it absolutely fascinating to see the and I'm not surprised at all because I'm quite used to it, but to see the pushback from reactionaries and, in the comments here and more generally with my work. It's like, I'm just asking for people to be given a fair chance to, for a level playing field. I mean, what are you so scared of? Wanting a level playing field, thinking that what is bad is the abuse of children rather than the abuse of children by Muslim people. Like, what is wrong with you?
Yeah, that's basically my analysis as well, is that it's not relevant to build it into a story about clash. I mean, look, I think I could in principle be persuaded by like very good evidence that something like that had relevance, but I've not seen that being done. What I've seen be done is rather people just like appealing to like low resolution storytelling and a perception of like othering, right, of cultures that don't fit, or people that don't look the right way or share a cultural background, so they would be bad. Very rarely, for example, have I seen people look at, well, is there if we look at the reference class of members of the EDL and their propensity to commit sexual assault, is there a disproportionate number of those people? Why have they not been concerned about that?
The Catholic Church?
Yeah. Well, actually, interestingly, in the case of Catholic priests, I think that this is a Catholic apologetics talking point, that Catholic priests commit sexual assault at rates lower than the general population. So this is, I think maybe the statistics are made up, right? Because it's an apologetics.
You're right. I mean, look, I don't know the statistics, right? But my point is, have you seen Tommy Robinson attack the Catholic Church with all the scandals that there's been, or saying that all Catholics are pedophiles? I don't think so, which is exactly the point he's making, right? The point that Musk is making is that certain communities are prone to this kind of behaviors. Then, again, regardless of the statistics, the same should be made of Catholics. And I don't hear any of these people saying it, which is weird. Which, of course, I would disagree with. Again, I don't believe that all Catholics are pedophiles, right? But like the thing is, like the lack of consistency in these people is just. It would be funny if it wasn't so dangerous, to be honest. But yeah.
I think a question that I was missing. This one. Does Aurelien think the denial of modern systematic racism today is racist, simply ignorant, or does it usually depend on the case?
This is a great question. But again, I mean, it goes back to the individualization of racism, right? And that's something that I'm less interested in, but something that some people have worked on. That's quite interesting, and you can find some of the links in some of the references in the book, or if you want to contact me, I'm very happy to pass some on about kind of the psychology behind colorblind racism, which I think is particularly fascinating in a way. For example, some colleagues in the US have done some research on people feeling, for example, like people who would say exactly the right thing in terms of anti-racism when they ask questions about kind of bringing down forms of systematic racism, they would be against it, while the people who would put their foot in their mouth when it comes to saying something racist would actually be against the forms of segregations that are in practice. So, for example, people who would use derogatory term might be against, for example, more equality in school provision, for example, or less segregation in school provision, and all these kind of things. So you can see how here it's not just about ignorance, it's also about privilege and about kind of protecting what you have while pretending not to be racist. So that's the psychology of it. But at the end of the day, what interests me more, as I said before, is really the kind of the power behind it in a way, and what it protects. And I think Charles Mills puts it very well when he talks about the racial contract. At the end of the day, when you are white, you are a beneficiary of a racial contract. As a white person, I benefit from the racial contract whether I want it or not, because we live in a system that is systemically privileging white people. So whether I want it or not at the moment, as it is today, and it doesn't have to be this way, but as it is today, I am benefiting from it. But I don't have to be a signatory, right? And so you become really, I think, like where it becomes even more problematic is when you become a signatory. Well, in fact, what you should be is a traitor to that contract. You are benefiting from it. If you're white, yeah, that's just the way. As a man, I'm benefiting from the patriarchal contract as well, the sexual contract, but I don't have to be a signatory to it. And I think that's, in a way, that's how you fight reactionary democracy as well.
So there is a question then about where you think privilege comes from. I mean, taking the kind of loaded where you think that's kind of like, oh, because you're obviously wrong. But in terms of, you mentioned power in the previous kind of answer, right, as well, and I think it's sort of related. Is what do you mean here when you talk about things like privilege and power?
But that's it. I mean, what I find fascinating as well is quite often people who ask these kind of questions in bad faith tend to think of themselves as people who know about history and things like that. But it's like, if you know a little bit about history, then you should know about power, and you should know about how power relationships have evolved to the point where certain people have certain characteristics that they use to their advantage, right, in a systemic way. It is just about power. Like, of course, feel free to ignore power if you benefit from it. I'm sure it makes you feel better about yourself, but I'm sorry, this is just the way things work, and this is the way things have always worked. So yeah, think about power. That's where privilege comes from. Power, quite simply. Being privileged doesn't mean you are necessarily a bad people. It just means you have more chances than others in society, or you have less barriers in your way. That's all. And that's not because of you personally. That's because of history, and that's because of power relationships over decades, centuries. That's it. That's as simple as that. I don't really understand how that's contentious, really.
And when you talk about power, sorry, are you meaning like wealth, status, some kind of combination of
a combination of all about the things that will help you kind of get ahead in life, right? The fact that, for example, for me, it will be easier to get a job, it will be easier to rent a place, it will be easier to get a mortgage, it will be easier to do lots of things that are not impossible for other people, but are much harder. I'm not gonna be like attacked because of my race, because of my gender, all these kind of things. Like, I mean, power has many shapes and forms, but the thing is like, that's what privilege is. It's, yeah.
And it's not that you're saying these people should be attacked or something, but you're trying to point out that, other groups are not benefiting in the same way. They can't just go about their lives.
Well, exactly. And it doesn't mean that I can't be attacked. I might be attacked, but the difference again, then I'm sure the following question is going to be like, oh yeah, but what about anti-white racism, and all that. Again, this is ridiculous. It's like, yeah, you can be insulted for being white, for being a man, for being whatever. Like, yes, that's an insult. That's not systemic. That's not going to prevent you from finding a job tomorrow. That's not going to prevent you from renting a place. It hurts, and I'm sorry if it happened to you, and that's what triggered you, and that's what kind of sent you down, that road. In a way, this is something that my colleague and Fran Amory and I have looked at when we looked at transphobia as well, which again is going to trigger probably Pine Creek. Yes, I did write about transphobia, and we looked at that. We looked at the way some people peaked in a way. They just try to find an excuse to justify their transphobia, but something happened to them, or they heard something, and then all of a sudden they become Islamophobic, or they become transphobic, and so on, and use that as an excuse. And yeah, that might be a hurtful, event, but then that shouldn't be generalized. That shouldn't be generalized onto communities that become homogenized and that become put under suspicion when they've done absolutely nothing.
Yeah, I mean, from listening to Doug's content for a while, I know that these issues of woke CRT and trans people have been really affecting his gated community in the US. So
yeah, I'm sure.
Yes. Jeremy asked the question. Can you ask why you talk about things like the motivations of commenters or questioners, or I guess even in your theorizing about people's political motivations? There's sometimes talk about like what non-rational or irrational conditions might lead to someone behaving in a certain way, rather than simply engaging with the arguments that they present sort of in a vacuum or something like that. Why engage in that way rather than, can't we just focus on the content of the arguments or something?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, it took me a while to see what you meant. It's because of experience, to be honest. And look, I'd rather have a good faith argument, but I know that some of the questions are not put in good faith. And unfortunately, yeah, maybe I've become overly cynical. There was a question about tolerance earlier where I was overly cynical, and I'm sorry about that. The problem is, unfortunately, we are facing such an onslaught. And again, it goes back to the point of debate, right? The idea of like the noise, it's making noise. And some colleagues have worked on this concept of noise. It's making a lot of noise and preventing us from actually having the conversations we need to have. So, here I'm being asked to to talk about culture, which is completely irrelevant to what we're talking about in a way, from my point of view, particularly because the person who asked that question is clearly not listening to the answer, and is not going to learn anything, or is not engaging really, is just trying to kind of catch me. And so it's a complete waste of time. And I'm really sorry, Jeremy, because I agree. We are wasting time, and I'm engaging with motivations because I think these motivations are political, right? And I think this is important. So I'm very happy to answer the questions, which I hope I've tried to do at least, but I don't want to ignore the motivations because I think they are part of what's diverting us from actually working towards a better world.
Yeah, I think, I often come across this because I'm very interested in philosophy of language and linguistics, where there's a lot of views in philosophy of language that are sort of like these idealized models where there's entities called propositions, and language is just a tool for expressing and getting that from one place to another. And the real important part of language is truth-apt propositions and analyzing them and things. Whereas, if you look at contemporary linguistics, language is viewed predominantly as a tool that's used by humans as social creatures for communication. So when we communicate with other people, we're not, we're driven by goals and ends that we want to achieve. We typically don't just kind of like go around saying random sentences. The number of planets in the universe is an even number or something. Like, people don't just go around shouting that because it doesn't achieve any of their purposes or goals, right? So similarly, a rhetorical move that's sometimes made in debates is to try and sort of like frame a question as if it's neutral, right? In order to get someone to say something that in a slightly different conversational context would kind of commit them to some kind of like racist implication, or like a political implication, a value implication, a claim about innate nature or something. So, for example, someone could ask the question about whether the average IQ of one demographic or another differs, right? And like, there is an answer to that question, but it's technically on its own, it's meaningless. But what's implied by that is that the explanation of that is like innate natures or essences that people in those groups have, or something like that, it's causally explained by either their genetics or something about them being a part of that demographic, rather than it being some other cause that's the explanation. So the communicative intent of someone asking that question is typically not because they're just super interested in what the mean between two groups is, but because they're interested about the political question and the causal story, right?
That's the thing. I mean, words matter, right? That's what discourse is about. That's why a lot of my work is on discourse. And that's, it takes us back to the start of this conversation, when I was talking about democracy, and we only see democracy as a question of votes and a question of tally of votes. But there's more to it, right? There's the meaning of words. There's the meaning of, the political campaigns, the speeches that are given, what it means to us to vote for a particular party, what it means to vote at all, what democracy means. Is it just voting, or is it more than that? Words matter. And yeah, absolutely, far beyond just the factual.
The final question then to close out is an off-topic question of what is your favorite movie and why is it not Amélie?
Yeah, that's a good question. No, it's not Amélie, but yeah, no. Yeah, see, that's culture again. As a French person, it should be Amélie, right? But it's not. No, what's my favorite movie? Wow, that's a good question. That's the first one, but I was kind of like, stop. It's really rare when I can't answer a question, but that's a factual one as well. See, maybe if you were asking me something that was kind of like,
you have to go for maybe of the past few years or something. There's been Gladiator 2 was not very good.
Gladiator 2. No, it wasn't Napoleon either. I'm sorry. I'm sorry to disappoint. No, I saw a movie that I really enjoyed fairly recently called I Saw the TV Glow, which was really, really good actually. Good kind of like semi-scary movie. Quite enjoyed it. Yeah. There was also another one. That was it Kill 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 or something like that? I've been watching lots of scary movies lately, which I've quite enjoyed. No, anyway, I can't remember, but sorry, Sandals, you finally stumped me. I can't answer that question.
Great. Well, thank you for your time. Thank you everyone for watching. I will end the stream here in a second, but if people want to kind of catch more of your work, where would you kind of direct them to, where they can find out more about you?
Yep. So you can find a lot of kind of the arguments that I've put forward today in the book that Aaron Winter and I co-authored, that was published in 2020. I've expanded on a lot of stuff since with Aaron, with other people as well, or on my own. All of this is online. Most of the work that I do is either freely accessible. The book is very cheap as well, which we've done on purpose, so that it's widely accessible. You can always find me easily on social media as well, or if you just Google my name, you'll see also the repository of all my work. So yeah, hopefully you find it interesting. And I want to stress that my work is not partly original. It's building on a massive amount of work from people who have done it from many different kind of backgrounds, and far more than I do. And what I'm trying to do is to kind of make it kind of more available as well. So massive tribute to them, really.
Great. Well, thank you for your time, and I'll end the stream there.